Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. We've received some feedback, which we continue to appreciate from our listeners. We definitely would like any more thoughts you have about topics you'd like us to cover or current issues in the grow space that you'd like us to discuss. We're always happy to focus on areas our listeners want to listen to, and those ideas are wonderful, so please keep them coming. Today, we're going to talk about spectrum, something that is near and dear to our hearts here at Black Dog LED. As those of you that know our product know, we make a very high quality product in terms of the build quality. But what really sets us apart beyond our build quality and our customer service and all of those things is our spectrum. That's really one of the main things that differentiates us in the LED grow light space. And so we thought it'd be worthwhile to do a little bit of a deep dive into how we arrived at this spectrum, which we've been developing and refining for, Kevin, about 11 years now.
More than 11 years.
So it's come a long way, and with Phyto-Max 3, obviously it's got some little minor tweaks to make it even better with Phyto-Max 3, in addition to the efficiency increases. So we thought it'd be worthwhile doing a deep dive into that. So why don't we start with a little broad overview of the spectrum, and what is our, let's call it spectrum philosophy. So instead of worrying about UV or this nanometer or that, let's talk a little bit about just broad philosophy and why we're different. And for those of you that are a little uninitiated to the LED grow light space, most, and by most I mean almost all of our competitors out there, use what we call a basic white LED spectrum, where they're using white LEDs, maybe one or two different color temperatures, a white, a warm, and a cool or something, and then they might throw in a little bit of just pure red LEDs to spike the spectrum so they get good flowering production. We call that a basic white spectrum. They often call that full spectrum because white is very broad and that it's smeared across a lot of wavelengths, but we don't consider it full because we think it's missing things that are important to the spectrum, and that's what Kevin's going to talk about. So for the uninitiated, a basic spectrum that you'd find in almost all of the other products out there is going to be a basic white spectrum using the same LEDs you'd find in a reading lamp at your bedside or your headlights or in your home overhead lighting. So that's your basic. Let's talk about what Black Dog does very different from those basic white LEDs we find on the market today.
Well, those white LEDs were really designed specifically for human use. They've been perfected. They even the technology that's behind them won a Nobel Prize a while ago for good reason, because they've revolutionized how efficient lighting can be for human eyes. And one of the ways that they've gotten so efficient for human eyes is by only covering the area of the spectrum that our eyes are capable of seeing. By not putting out photons that our eyes can't see, they're inherently more efficient, because a lot of the older technologies, such as fluorescent or high pressure sodium, metal halide, actually put out significant spikes of photons in ranges that the human eye can't see, whether it's in ultraviolet or most often it's in the infrared region of the spectrum. We can't see that, but we can still perceive it. When you put your hand under the light, it feels warmer than it should for the brightness of the light, because it's essentially acting as a heat lamp. It's putting out a bunch of infrared light that plants can't necessarily use. Plants can use some infrared light, but it depends on the exact wavelength as to whether or not they can use it. So our design philosophy has always been, rather than trying to aim at a spectrum that has been designed to be perfect for human eyes, we've always tried to perfect our spectrum for growing plants better. Not appearing as bright as possible to human eyes, but appearing as bright as possible to plants. Furthermore, within trying to perfect that spectrum, there's a lot of studies that have been done for over 100 years now, where people have figured out that you give different colors of light to plants, you can get them to do different things. You can make them grow their leaves bigger, you can make them stretch their stalks longer, and so we've specifically designed our spectrum to try and get the most flower and fruit production that you possibly can out of a plant. Now, that does come at the expense of stems. Our lights are not designed for plants that you want to grow for their stems, things like bamboo or celery or rhubarb, but those are things that most people are not typically growing indoors anyhow. So our light spectrum has specifically been designed and targeted and refined over the years to maximize flower and fruit production, not leaf or stem production.
And when you were talking about the white LEDs being optimized, and again, this is where I think we're different, and if you could speak a little more to it, is they've been optimized for one thing only, and that's the human eye response. And a lot of what you do with our spectrum is looking at what I'd call the plant response, right? And I'd like to call it the plant eye response, but that's very misleading. But it's the same thing as when we look at a light, we perceive it to be something as humans. Our eyes are a certain way. Plants have a different perception of light. And to your point, the white light is really aimed at the human perception, whereas we're trying to go after the plant perception.
Correct. And our eyes actually are very, very poor at determining what color makeup, what the actual spectrum of a light source is. Fluorescent lights and white LEDs can appear equally white, equally bright to us, even though the spectrum of light, if you look at it with an actual spectroradiometer that breaks it down into all the individual wavelengths, looks dramatically different on a graph. Our eyes still perceive it as white, and that's because our eyes only really have 3 different color receptors in them. We see red, green, and blue. That's why when you get up really close to a phone screen or a TV screen, you can see it's actually made up of nothing but little tiny red, green, and blue dots, because using a combination of different brightnesses for those 3 different colors, we can trick our eyes into seeing anything from white to brown to orange, all of the colors that we can perceive as humans. But plants are not limited in that 3-color response like our eyes are. They actually have a bunch of different chemical compounds in each leaf that are absorbing light at all sorts of different wavelengths. So in essence, they're seeing a wider range of light than our eyes are capable of perceiving. Furthermore, our eyes have mostly the green color receptor in them, followed secondly by red color receptor, and then only about 10% of our color receptors in our eyes are sensitive to blue light, which means if you have mostly green light in your spectrum and a little bit of red light and then just a tiny bit of blue light, it will look white to our eyes because our eyes are capable of perceiving those colors in that ratio, and it looks really bright to us. If you increase the amount of blue light, it doesn't look that much brighter to our eyes. So it's less efficient to give our eyes blue light as compared to yellow light or green light especially. And that's why when you look at a spectrum of one of these white or so-called full spectrum LEDs, they actually peak in the yellow and green area of the spectrum where our eyes are most sensitive. And that's because they're designed to look as bright as possible to our eyes. But plants are actually completely flipped around and opposite for that. Chlorophyll is really not very good at absorbing green or yellow light. That's why it looks green to us. Plants reflect more green light than any other color. But chlorophyll is really good at absorbing red and blue light, and that's where plants photosynthesize most efficiently. It's not that they can't use yellow light or green light for photosynthesis, but the chlorophyll strongly prefers that red and the blue light. So by targeting that area of the spectrum, we actually get the plant to photosynthesize more efficiently. Part of the side effects of that is when you're giving a plant a lot of yellow light, for example, with high pressure sodium light, it's not that plants can't photosynthesize with it, but because chlorophyll can't absorb that directly, it has to use a different pigment in the leaf to absorb that yellow light. It steals a little bit of energy from that yellow photon, releases that energy in the form of heat, heating up the leaves, and then it re-releases the photon to the chlorophyll molecule next to it as a red photon that the chlorophyll can absorb. So yellow light heats up plants' leaves more than red or blue light does, which is why, when you think about it, under high-pressure sodium lights, plants will fry if they get up to 85 degrees. Under a high-pressure sodium light, you'll actually start seeing signs of heat stress on the plants, whereas if you take that same plant and you put it out under full natural sunlight, that plant can tolerate 100, 110 degrees, no problem without frying. And it's because there's more red and blue light as compared to the yellow light in natural sunlight spectrum. So it's not that plants can't use that yellow light, it's just less efficient and it heats up their leaves more and forces you to run your grow cooler.
So is this why when you explain the efficiency and how we perceive light a certain way with the rods in our eyes and that, and then versus plants, is it why that when I look at a basic white LED grow light, it looks brighter sometimes than ours might look because my eyes aren't sensitive to the colors we're using?
Watt for watt, if you take 100 watts of our light spectrum and you put it next to 100 watts of pure white LEDs, the full spectrum so-called LEDs, that other LED light, the white one, is going to appear much brighter to our eyes because it's designed to appear much brighter to our eyes. Our light actually looks less intense, watt for watt, because we're specifically putting out colors of light that plants preferentially absorb but our eyes are less sensitive to in the blue and the red end of the spectrum. And then we're also putting out light that our eyes are even incapable of seeing in the infrared and the ultraviolet area of the spectrum. Our eyes can't even see that. These full spectrum white LEDs don't even put that out, or put out very little of it. But plants actually use that.
Well, so one question there, when you start to look at that and you start to take apart the spectrum and you say, well, this is easier to see than that, and like you said, they're going to be 100 watts to 100 watts. Does that hold true? This is a tough question because we're not talking about a specific competitor, but if I took 100 watts of theirs and 100 watts of our spectrum, theirs looks brighter, but from at the end of the day, yield perspective, how do you feel that would look at the end of the day? Because, we're not here to enjoy our lights. We're here to enjoy the output of our lights, right? The fruit of our labors, if you will.
Well, we've seen from our own tests what it looks like, and that is we actually do yield better and higher quality. We yield more and higher quality. And if we could get away with just using white LEDs and get the same yield, it would actually be advantageous to us to do that, because these white LEDs are being mass manufactured for the human lighting market, and they are by far less expensive than the LEDs we actually have to use to get a plant ideal spectrum. So we could make a cheaper light. We could make more profit if we just switch to a all white LED, maybe throw some reds in there like 90% of our competitors are doing, to make it plant optimized. So they throw in a little bit of red on top of these LEDs that are designed for human use to make it grow a little bit better than the all white LEDs do. We could make it cheaper, but it wouldn't actually make plants grow better.
Well, so that brings us to kind of the million-dollar question I wanted to ask, which is, so if these are better, and we know the science is there to back up the wavelengths we're using, the spectrum blend that we're using, we know science is there to back it up. So then my question would have been, why do the competitors use white? And I think from what you just said, a lot of it is cost driven. It's just cheaper for them to manufacture a product. Even if it's inferior, it's cheaper for them to produce that cheaper product using white LEDs.
It's cheaper in multiple respects. First of all, the white LEDs are far less expensive than the other colors are. And then when you start getting into some of these other colors of LEDs, you have to start worrying about more technical issues, running them at different currents, different voltages, keeping them cooler than the white LEDs that are designed and have had a lot of research put into them so that they're allowed to run a little bit warmer without degrading as quickly. So there's a lot of technical reasons, supply chain reasons. If you have 8 different colors of LEDs like we use, you've got a lot more parts that you have to actually procure, as opposed to just a white LED and a red LED. So it makes it more expensive on many different levels. And more technically complicated.
Money does drive the world, so it's not surprising they're choosing the cheaper option there. So that's given, I think, everyone a good overview of what the other spectrums are, why we do some of this. Should we do a little deep dive into some of the colors that we use and why we use them, especially some of the ones that are harder to manage or either more expensive, the LEDs themselves? As you pointed out, a lot of them are more expensive, and they're also harder to engineer a fixture that will keep them stable and living a long time. Do you want to talk about some of those specific spectrums that are, let's say, more esoteric than the general stuff that we see out there?
Yep. So, for the past 8-10 years, really, when you go back even just 8 years ago, the white LEDs were not as viable as they are right now. They were just starting to really appear on the market. They just had not matured as a technology at that point yet. But when they came on, because of the human applications for them, they took over the market by storm. But we're using a bunch of different colors. We're using 8 different colors, if you want to call them colors, because 2 or 3 of them are not even really visible to the human eye. So we've seen an evolution in the market from our competitors of people using just white LEDs to white LEDs plus maybe a 660 nanometer red. Now, 660 nanometers is on the far end of the human range of the visual spectrum. Our eyes can typically see between 400 and 700 nanometers. At 660, it's far enough red that it's not appearing as bright red as you might want. So, for example, the LEDs that they put in car taillights, red LEDs they put in car taillights, are not 660 nanometers. They're using 630 nanometers because that appears photon per photon a brighter red to our eyes than the 660 do. But plants really, really like that 660 nanometers. So we've been using it since the inception of our product. over 11 years ago. But we're starting to see competitors in the past few years use these white so-called full spectrum LEDs that don't have much 660 nanometer content in their spectrum, and they're spiking it by putting in some of these 660 nanometer red LEDs to really get it to grow plants a little bit better, and noticeably better than just the pure white LEDs. That's why they do it. It would be cheaper for them to just use the white LEDs, so they're putting in the 660 for a reason. It does make the plants grow better. Just in the past couple of years, we've started seeing some competitors now also throwing in some infrared LEDs between 700 and 750 nanometers. Now, this is outside of humans' visual range, and it's even outside of the definition of photosynthetic active radiation. There's two different kinds of process that happens within the leaf. One's called photosystem 1, and the other one's called photosystem 2. And when light is absorbed by the plant, these two different photosystems have to work together to actually successfully create a sugar molecule that the plant is storing its energy in. So both of the photosystems can use all of the wavelengths between 400 and 700 nanometers, but one of them can actually use these near infrared or far red photons between 700 and 750 nanometers to help increase the efficiency of the process. And it turns out adding some of this not visible to us light between 700 and 750 nanometers actually makes photosynthesis far more efficient. And this was shown back in the 1950s by a scientist named Emerson. And we've been incorporating these infrared diodes in our product since day one of Black Dog LED. But some of our competitors are now starting to throw in some of that infrared as well, because it does make the plants grow better. But what's really made us different is from day one, we've also thrown in stuff on the other end of the spectrum, the more complicated LEDs, as you have pointed out, and the more costly LEDs, which are in the violet, at the extreme end of our visual perception, between 400 and 450 nanometers, that our eyes are not very good at looking at light like that and perceiving it as bright, so it does not appear, even though these LEDs may be pumping out just as many photons, it doesn't look as bright as even just a royal blue photon at 400, or a royal blue LED at 450 nanometers would to our eyes. So these violet photons between 400 and 450 nanometers don't appear as bright to our eyes as a royal blue 450 nanometer LED would. So photon per photon, they don't look as bright to our eyes. They're not being made for human use for that reason, at least not on any large scale, because it's really only niche markets that use them. However, plants actually use chlorophyll A preferentially absorbs photons between about 430 and 445 nanometers. And so this is deeper in the blue region than human eyes are good at perceiving, but that's where chlorophyll A preferentially likes absorbing its photons, in the blue end of the region. Then we're going even further, and we're putting out ultraviolet photons that are invisible to human eyes, at least most humans. And these are photons that are not necessarily used for photosynthesis, although they do contribute to photosynthesis a little bit in the plants. But what's more interesting about the ultraviolet photons is what they trigger the plants to do. Now, we can't see these photons, but they still trigger a response in humans as well. And it turns out that these ultraviolet photons trigger a response in most living things. And most living things have to protect themselves from this ultraviolet light, and they do that in a variety of different ways. Our skin, when it's exposed to ultraviolet light, produces melanin to produce a more tan skin to help block more of this ultraviolet light. Plants do the same thing. They produce natural sunscreen compounds and natural shade structures, which vary from plant to plant. But they'll also produce things like anthocyanin, which is that reddish purple pigment that, for example, tomatoes are full of, and a lot of cannabis strains, the purpler strains that you see, that's anthocyanin. So by putting ultraviolet light in there, we're getting more of that color expression in the plants. However, what's even more interesting is THC and CBD are also natural sunscreen compounds. So by putting ultraviolet light in there, we're triggering the plants to actually create more THC and CBD. Now, as an unexpected side effect, we're also seeing increased levels of terpenes. And in fact, in some cases where we've done tests growing the plants under our light spectrum versus other light spectrums, we're seeing production of terpenes when they're exposed to ultraviolet light that simply aren't even present in the same strain that was not grown with ultraviolet light. So it's triggering not just more production, but it's triggering production of different terpenes that weren't even there in the other strains. Ultraviolet light, though, doesn't stop there. Trichomes are natural shade structures that the flowers are producing to help shade themselves from excess bright light, including ultraviolet light. So with more ultraviolet light in the spectrum, we see increased trichome production. In addition, plants protect themselves by creating a thicker cuticle or a thicker skin on the outside of the plant, thicker cell walls, and that helps make the plants more resistant to drought as well as pathogens. Things like bacteria, fungi, insects, piercing, sucking insects have a harder time getting through this thicker cuticle, and so it makes the plants more resistant to all of these things. And then ultraviolet light also triggers a reduction in what's called apical dominance, which is the normal Christmas tree type shape that you expect from a plant, where the topmost growth is taken over and really dominates the plant and makes the plant grow tall and narrow and like in a Christmas tree shape. But ultraviolet light helps suppress that so that you get a wider, bushier plant, so that you get actually more different colas on the plant. Instead of one giant cola, you get a whole bunch more smaller colas that together add up to way more weight overall.
So what you're trying to tell me is all this stuff, especially it sounds like on the blue side, and certainly with the spectrum in general, what you're saying is it can produce a stronger, healthier plant and higher quality, and the quality in this case being actually measurable in terms of terpenes, THC, CBD, active, what you and I would call active compounds.
And then because you're keeping the plant shorter overall but bushier, you're also getting increased yield, an increased yield per square foot as well. And then because these ultraviolet and violet photons have more energy to begin with, because they're a shorter wavelength, higher energy photon, they can afford to bounce around in the plant canopy and lose energy on their way through and still end up at the bottom of the plant canopy, maybe not as an ultraviolet photon anymore, but as a photon that is still usable for photosynthesis for the plant. So we're actually getting deeper canopy penetration on a shorter, bushier plant, which increases yield, and we're seeing typically double to triple the industry standard yield per square foot.
It's pretty impressive. So in reality, the spectrum, we know power is important, wattage and all that, but maybe a lot of these people that are looking at LEDs and they're just looking at wattage, they're missing a big part of the picture is what I'm hearing.
And it's not just wattage. You can have two different LED lights that are exactly the same wattage that'll put out vastly different numbers of photons. And there's a variety of different ways to cheat that, but let's just say that LEDs are not all equal. There's a huge gambit of different efficiency LEDs available on the market, even for a particular color. For example, a white LED versus another white LED. I can buy one LED that's a 1 watt LED that puts out twice as many photons as another white 1 watt LED does. So there's efficiency there, but then on top of that, you've also got spectral efficiency, making the plant photosynthesize more efficiently. And that's where these white LEDs are really failing, because they're putting out a bunch of yellow photons that the plant can use to photosynthesize, but it's heating up their leaves. You can't increase the light level past a certain amount before you start frying the leaves from all of this excess heat. And that's where we can actually put even more light onto the plants by focusing it on the areas of the spectrum where it's absorbed and utilized efficiently.
And so, with regard to this, in terms of the breaking down of the spectrum, if you were to start to weight stuff, and you were talking about red, and then because, like you said, everybody has that middle ground covered to some degree in different ways with a white, let's say. And you spoke about the red and blue. Is there anything there in terms of you say, hey, because I know that we believe they add red to those white spectrums to help with yields, let's say, really is where they're going to help them. One, would you agree with that with putting red in ours? And then what would you say? Is blue really focused more on quality? But no, you'd say it's quality and yield as well.
So if you don't have enough blue light in your spectrum, you're going to trigger a response in the plant that's a built-in hormonal response, and it's not just for cannabis plants. It's for pretty much all higher plants, all land plants. And they evolved this a very long time ago. If they're seeing a bunch of red light and not a lot of blue light, they automatically think that they're living outdoors and they're not seeing the blue sky. They perceive that something is up above them, shading them out. And that triggers a hormonal response in the plant that causes them to stretch their stems. And when they have to stretch their stems, they have to put more energy into growing those stems. And then they have to put more energy into pumping the nutrients and water up those stems to get to the flowers at the top. And if we were growing the plants that we're growing indoors for their stems, then that's exactly what we'd want to do, is encourage that longer stem length and encourage them to grow stems. But when we do that, it comes at the cost of growing more flowers or fruit. And so by discouraging their stem length, by discouraging their internodal spacing and making that as short as possible, we can actually give the plant more energy left over for creating more flowers and fruit. And that's exactly what our spectrum does. So it's the ratio of red to blue is very important, as well as the ratio of far red to red. You need to get that right to discourage this internodal elongation, the stem lengthening on plants, so that you're growing them for their flowers and fruit as opposed to growing longer stems.
So you're saying is the other, so that's great about ours, and the other ones that you're not calling the basic white kind of LED grow light spectrum with the white, maybe some red, they're going to actually grow as taller, lankier plant in general?
It
larger?
Depends on exactly how much red they put in there, and this is where there's an unfortunate feedback mechanism, not for plants but for economics, and for statistics on paper, because the 660 nanometer red LEDs, because they're lower energy photons and the redder end of the spectrum, and because of the research that's put into them, they can actually pump out more photons per watt than even a full spectrum white LED can. And it's simple physics dictates that you can get more red photons per watt of energy than you could the blue photons that are actually underlying that white full spectrum LED. So by adding more red, you can make your light look better on paper. You can put out more photons per watt. You can have more photons coming out of your light overall, but the more red you add there, you're starting to threaten growing the plant's stems longer and longer and longer and decreasing your actual flower and fruit yield at the expense of the stem. So it's important to get the ratio of red to blue red, and that's where the ratio of the white LEDs to red LEDs is more important in those competitors that are choosing to do that. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more people that are putting in a lot more red to make their light look better on paper, more photons per watt, but it comes at the expense of actually yield in the end.
Yeah, and so if we look at that, Kevin, and we really back into that and say, okay, so they might make a light a little bit cheaper because they're using white LEDs, and red LEDs aren't that much, and they're easier to keep cool and easier to manage, so now they can build a cheaper fixture. Then they put the fixture they can sell for less, but what I'm hearing is it's going to probably underperform in terms of yield and make a taller plant, which we generally want to avoid indoors because we're usually fighting some kind of height restriction. There's a ceiling up there somewhere. We're not outside.
And not just height restrictions, taller plants are more annoying to deal with. They get floppy. You end up with stems breaking, flopping over into the pot next to them and getting dirt on the flowers. It's just annoying dealing with tall, floppy plants compared to nice, short, bushy plants that are laden with flowers.
So let's switch gears real quick and go back to something you spoke about earlier about what they're putting into theirs, and that we're seeing them tweak a little bit now. You know, we've been doing this a long time. Most of our competitors don't bother putting the higher end LEDs, the more let's say crazy colors that we use, whether it's UV or a kind of a violet like you were talking about, a far blue. With regard to that, we are seeing now for the first time some of the major manufacturers come out with their supplemental UV bars that they're throwing out, and you know we're getting questions about those. Do you want to speak a little bit to how we look at those, or how we think of those as something, because they're now something they've got to add. It's something else you have to buy. They might not be cooled properly. So how do you feel about those supplemental UV fixtures that are coming out now?
Yeah, it's very interesting because a lot of these same manufacturers have in the past said, oh, you don't need UV, you don't need UV. Now they're coming out with supplemental UV bars because there is actually evidence that UV actually works and it helps. But the problem with these supplemental lights is many different actual issues. One of which is a lot of the supplemental UV bars, you don't know how much ultraviolet light that's putting out, number one. So how do you get the ratio correct? Because if you're not getting enough ultraviolet light over the plants, you're not going to see the benefit from it. If you get too much ultraviolet light over the plants, you're actually going to burn them. So it's important to get the ratio correct. We have 3.4% ultraviolet photons in our spectrum. So 3.4% of all of the photons our light is putting out are in the ultraviolet range. That matches up closely to the sun's natural roughly 3% of photons that strike the Earth's surface are in the ultraviolet range from natural sunlight. We're putting out slightly more ultraviolet light to get more of that effect from the plants without overdoing it, as well as we are deliberately avoiding the extremely high energy and extremely damaging and extremely cancer-causing ultraviolet B photons that are present in natural sunlight. Only right around noon every day do they actually make it through the atmosphere, but we're not putting out that ultraviolet B light. We're putting out the lower energy ultraviolet A, and so in order to make up for that, we're putting out slightly more than the sun's total ultraviolet output. But with the supplemental bars, you really don't know how many you need to get the effects that you want, and it's really easy to overdo. I've even seen pictures from some of our customers. One person unfortunately didn't realize how strong their UV fluorescent fixture was, and they worked around it and got severe burns on the side of their face from just, I think it was 20 minutes, she said, of working next to the light. So it can be very dangerous, not just for your plants, but for you, because you don't know, and unfortunately the closer you get to the supplemental bar, the more ultraviolet you're getting, which is this next problem with the supplemental bars, is positioning them properly. Our ultraviolet LEDs are spread out across our entire light fixture so that no matter where you are underneath the light fixture, you're seeing the same ratio, that 3.4% ultraviolet light. But with the supplemental bars, as you get closer to the bar, you're seeing much, much, much higher levels of ultraviolet. And it's not just a linear thing. It's actually called, due to the inverse square law of light, you're seeing a doubling every time you get 1 foot closer, you're seeing a doubling, and then you get 1 foot closer again, it's actually 9 times the intensity of light. So it's very difficult with the supplemental bars to distribute that ultraviolet light efficiently and appropriately across your canopy. One area is definitely going to get a lot more than the rest.
Gotcha. Because it's not integrated into the fixture.
Because it's not integrated into the fixture itself.
You know, a lot of the people that listen to our podcast, we know this from hearing from them, tend to be on the, let's say, geekier, nerdier side. One thing you were talking about is, you know, on paper. And that's something we've always struggled with because, and I think consumers struggle with it too, is how do you read the spec sheet or understand the spec sheet or understand a product that's a grow light and really kind of end up with a basic score. And we've always said there's no single thing you could look at to do that. But by putting all these different things, especially the energy that falls outside of par, outside of the range you were discussing earlier, they make us look worse on paper because everyone's kind of settled on par. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, if you're looking at the photosynthetic active radiation, the 400 to 700 nanometer range, which again is an arbitrary definition, plants do use photons outside of that range for photosynthesis. But 100 years ago, they decided arbitrarily to call the 400 to 700 nanometer range the photosynthetic active range. So by deliberately putting out photons, I mean, we've got several colors of LEDs that are entirely outside of that range. So we're putting energy into creating photons outside of that range. It makes our light absolutely look worse on paper in terms of the PPFD or the photosynthetic photon flux, because that's only considering the photons in that par range. In terms of photosynthetic photon efficacy, which is only considering photons in that 400 to 700 nanometer range, makes us look worse because we're deliberately spending electricity putting out photons outside that range. However, it grows plants better. So if you look at yield per watt, we do better.
Yeah. So as we say, luckily we don't grow on paper.
Yes.
We grow in the real world. So we might not look as good on paper, but in the real world we do. Well, that is some interesting stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed the Spectrum stuff today. Do you have anything more to add, Kevin? Anything more you'd like to throw out there? Any good resources if somebody wants to educate themselves more? Who do you consider, or where would you, if we had somebody that's listening is like, this is fascinating, I'd like to learn more about Spectrum, what would you point them to as a resource? Because I know it's a very in-depth, and it's also a very emerging science in that now with LEDs we have the ability to test things we couldn't have with regard to isolating colors and only throwing certain colors at a plant. So it's also not only interesting, but it's also emerging in many ways. So where would you point someone?
It gets very complicated too, because there have been many studies that were done very carefully in the past that came to certain conclusions about what spectrum, what colors of light plants use most efficiently, but they were ignoring other variables, such as the temperature that they were doing the experiment at. And it turns out, as we've demonstrated ourselves, that the color of light you shine on a leaf actually changes the temperature of the leaf. So there's a lot of studies out there that look like they're definitive on paper. It looks like McCree, for example, did a study in the 1970s that said that, oh, it's kind of the yellowish light is the most efficient, the yellowish orange light is the most efficient at photosynthesis. But that's ignoring all sorts of other effects, such as he was only looking at a postage stamp sized piece of a leaf that was being held at a constant temperature in the apparatus he was testing. So if you shine yellow light on it, it's going to heat up that little piece of a leaf a little bit more than if he was shining red or blue. So maybe it's just that the leaf was happier photosynthesizing when it was a little warmer than he was actually holding it. Secondly, he's only looking at a piece of a leaf. Plants don't grow that way. They have multiple leaves stacked on top of each other, and you have to consider the colors of light that make it through the plant canopy down to that next leaf in the canopy, and the third leaf down, and the fifth leaf down. So unfortunately, there's a ton of studies out there, all of which show an incomplete picture of what's going on. So it's very easy to take one study, read it carefully, and come to the wrong conclusions, or at least not get a complete total picture of what's really going on. Dr. Bruce Bugby from Utah State University is a wonderful resource. He's been looking into this along with a lot of his graduate students for a very long time. They're still doing studies, we're still doing studies. No one has a complete picture yet, but one thing that I think has emerged is it's way more complicated than anyone would have guessed a long time ago.
Well, as I would say, growing cannabis is easy, but recreating Mother Nature indoors is hard because there's so many things at play, right? There's so much going on in a garden, much of which we can't even perceive as human beings. So it's very interesting.
Well, and there's those things that we want to try and recreate from outdoors, and then there's those things like spider mites that we really don't want to recreate from outdoors.
Yeah, or as you pointed out, UVB, let's say,
Yeah.
that's out there, but we have no need for it in the garden. It's dangerous, and so we don't bring it in there. So there are things we can do maybe a little better, but not everything. So, and it is complex. So yeah, those are some great resources, and Dr. Bruce Bugby is a great resource. We're hopefully going to have him on our show in the near future. We're working on that. Just thank you all again for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this installment of Cultivation Cast. If you have any questions about the content or have an idea for a future topic, as I said at the beginning, please get those to us. You can send them to podcast@blackdogled.com. That's podcast@blackdogled.com. Or feel free to reach out to us through our help desk, a contact us form on our site or anything like that. So again, thanks for joining us, and happy gardening.